We may not win today, gentlemen, but we'll have a good time.
Hey everybody, this is a review video for the gaming table that I built. I'm going to talk about some pros and cons about the table, what I feel like are pros and cons for the table. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the games I've played on the table, the ways that I've used it. I think I'll talk about some general considerations if you're looking to build a gaming table like this and you're thinking about incorporating some of the elements here. And then I'll also talk about some future considerations for the gaming table and some things I might do. So here we go. Probably the biggest pro I feel like about this table is the versatility, and I completely intended that. I really wanted to think out a lot of the major games that I wanted to play on this table, and I also just wanted to make it pretty universal. So the ways that I went about doing that are, first I made the size of the table a 4 foot by 6 foot table, so I could, at the time that was like standard 40k, Warhammer 40k games. And it can break down. You can drop one leaf down and make a 4 foot by 4 foot table. I don't think I'd ever really drop both of the leaves down to just play on a 2 by 4 foot, but you can adjust the size of the table that way, but it can go up to the biggest game that I want to play. The other thing is the cards and the rail system allow it to be useful for a lot of different situations. So for D&D, I made some player desks. They can hold the book, they can hold a lot of dice, they have some extra card slots. So wherever you want to sit for D&D, you just slot one of those in and you've got a little player desk station to help keep the space in front of you kind of clear. If you don't need those, you don't need to use it if you're playing something else. If you're just having a game night and you just want to have drinks around, you just slot in a cup holder wherever you want, wherever you're standing or sitting or playing or whatever. And then generally speaking, a lot of these games are going to have either like optional cards, like the spell cards for D&D, or the stratagem cards and little data card things for 40k and Kill Team and that kind of stuff. And I just really like, for whatever of those games, and also for like Settlers of Catan, we got the resource cards and everything. I like being able to keep them organized. So if I'm playing a cleric, I can keep my healing spells kind of on one slot or one row, kind of grouped together on this rail. And you know, if I want to have my damaging spells or my support spells, I can kind of organize them so it's a little bit easier to play games and kind of run them. And the same thing with like Catan, if you wanted to organize your resources, or you know, Monopoly, you wanted to organize your properties or something. It just is something that's pretty universal, and I really like it. I put in 3 rows, so there's a lot of potential for having cards. Or a lot of capacity for cards depending on what game you're playing, and I just like how it can be used in a lot of different ways for a lot of different games. But if you don't use it, it just kind of looks like a decorative feature on the rail. The storage that I get underneath the main section, I think, is another really big pro. The bottom panel here, this bottom panel goes all the way out to the end of the leg, so it's a full 4 feet of space down there, so that is really nice for me to store gaming mats. I love being able to just have them right there. They're always with the table. They're always ready to go. I put rails on here just like I have on my storage shelves in the gaming room here, so I can just take one off and have it down there. So this could be an army, you know, of a 40k army, or for Kill Team or anything like that. Or it could be you know, a bunch of the monsters that you have prepped for an encounter for D&D or something. Right now I just have some dungeon tiles on a shelf that's kind of stored down here, just to kind of store them away, but that could be anything. And if you weren't planning on playing those games, you could just leave this space free and not put those rails on there, and you just would have a ton of space to put some of the boxes for the board games that you would be playing on the table. The drawer, I made this is a 6-inch deep drawer, or 6.5. It's just got a lot of space for dice, for cards, for D&D props and different things. And I've got one of these drawers on each side of the table, so there's one over on the other side as well as this side. So that's nice, because then for D&D I can kind of have a DM side and a player's side, but that just is a big storage factor, and I've really appreciated that. I've already kind of touched on this, but I think it's worth making its own point. Big pro for me is how this is really a universal table. It's not just made for 40k. It's not just a big table that's in a fixed position where this can't kind of collapse down and you have it dedicated for just that one sole purpose. I've played everything from like D&D to 40K to Scrabble, Monopoly, any kind of game. It's just so versatile for anything from like a family game night to just a one-on-one skirmish or kind of war games to a big D&D group. I love that it fills a lot of roles. I think that's a big pro for the table. Another big pro for me, I'm a tall guy. I'm like 6'3", so having a good bit of leg space and not like cramming my knees underneath something or just jamming them on something was a big thing to consider. And there's a lot of space with these gate legs. They come out at such an angle that there's a lot of free space if you're sitting in the middle on this side. There's a lot of free space if you're sitting at a corner, and there's a lot of free space if you're sitting at the side on the adjacent corner. So you can be kind of belly up to the table, and it is just not a problem. There's just tons of room for you. So that's one that I've really liked. Another big pro, after using it, that I didn't realize was going to be a pro in the beginning, is the weight of this table. This is solid hardwood. I made this all out of solid walnut, and it's a beast and a half. I think it's close to 200 pounds. I don't really have a way of measuring it, but I tried to calculate it out with the density of walnut and kind of how many board feet I have in this table. And it's somewhere really close to 200 pounds. That, and there's also some hardware, the casters and the hinges and things. But, at first I thought, it's going to be kind of heavy scooting it around and things. But the nice thing about having all that weight is if you're leaning out and you bump it, if you're leaning out to mess with pieces for 40K or something, or for D&D, or walking by and you kind of bump it, it's got a good bit of resistance to shaking your pieces and everything. So that's been kind of nice. I actually, in hindsight, I don't think I'd want to make a super light table for that reason. It's kind of nice to have a little bit of heft and a little bit of weight to it. So what are some of the cons? Well, one of the big cons is the weight, because it does take quite a bit to move this thing around on carpet. It's 200 pounds, it's on casters, which makes it, I don't feel like it's too much of a problem, but it definitely requires some oomph and kind of directing it through a door. You got to make sure you have kind of the space and everything to really move it around. So I at first thought the weight was only going to be a con in that regard, but after playing with it and having people accidentally bump it and that kind of stuff while you're playing something, you got something set up that's a little bit more elaborate, like if you've got terrain for D&D or for 40K or a skirmish game or something, it's kind of nice for it to have some heft and some inertia if somebody bumps it a little bit. So it kind of falls in both of those categories for me, just for different reasons. And there is another big con that kind of came up while we were playing D&D. If you're sitting in this spot, kind of in the middle of one of the long sides of the table, and you're a player spot, you want to use one of the player desks here, it's nice to have some depth here so you can store a few books. If you had a couple of books for your character, the PHB, and maybe another book or something that you used, either to build it or something else that you're kind of running for your game. So it's nice to have this, in front of you here, but when you put it in front of the drawer, it hangs down enough that the drawer can't come out when it's there. So it might cause you like a little bit of a frustration if you forget something while you're playing. You might have to, take your book and your dice and stuff off and then get something that you forgot about. It's not a terrible big deal breaker for me, but it's something where you might want to consider making a player desk that doesn't have this bottom part, so it's just one board, because the depth, if it was just one board and it didn't have that space to store the books down here, the drawer would be able to clear it. So there's a way around that one, and I may even make some player desks that are like that in the future and kind of solve that problem. But it's something I didn't think about, and you might want to think about if you're going to make a rail system in the drawer. It's a consideration. Another con is the leg space if you're at this spot. So if you're sitting here, let's say again, maybe it's for D&D and you're sitting here, really, you might have that player desk in front of you. So this is actually feels like the edge and your knees aren't really kind of bumping underneath the table, that works out pretty good. But if you weren't using that, or if you wanted to get up closer, yeah, you've got a little bit of a knee problem that's kind of right there. It's a little bit comfortable to kind of prop my feet up on that lower panel. That just kind of feels kind of comfortable and normal. But I've also kind of just done a little bit of an angle, kind of slide around one side of the leg, or slide around the other side if I'm in that middle spot. But I knew that going into this, and I did not want to lose the 4-foot length on that panel underneath so that I could store those gaming mats down there. So it's one that I kind of anticipated, and I just would rather have than it be the other way around. And the last maybe big potential con that I think about this table is the technical skill and the power tools involved in making it. I still consider myself an amateur woodworker. I feel like I'm really proud of this table, but I still feel like I'm learning a lot. But I definitely have quite a repertoire of tools in the garage. I used a planer and a jointer, a miter saw, a table saw, a router, biscuit joiner. I used a lot of different things that are very kind of woodworking specific to make this table. And again, it's out of solid walnut, so it's a solid hardwood table. And not everybody's going to be comfortable doing that. I mean, there's chisel work too, right? Mortise and tenon, some chisel work. So all of those things, there's certainly other ways to do it. You could do it in a simpler construction and that kind of thing. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. But if you wanted something that kind of looked like this, you're not going to be able to just kind of walk out and make it. I practiced every joint and every cut that I needed to make for this on a different project before I went to make this thing. So I was practicing miter cuts before I ever went to make the rails here. I was doing some things with the router before I ever went to make the rail system. I was making some panels with the biscuit joiner before I ever tried to put together these huge panels. And I'd done some mortise and tenon on some real simple things before I went to make these. So if you do go that route, I just think it's really worth this not being your first run, because it's a pretty extensive piece. It was a lot of fun. I'm really proud of it, but word of warning, either maybe kind of simplify the build, if you, depending on what your skill level and your access to tools is, but that's one that's definitely a big consideration. It might make it difficult for some people to make. So I've already kind of talked about some of the games that I've played on this table, but I would say the one I played the most was D&D. I got a lot of D&D in on this table prior to March of 2020. I did, and I got several kind of family gaming nights with my kids are kind of too young to play like games on this, but there's another some family friends that have a big family, and we kind of got together and did several game nights. So the one I played the most is D&D. I really like the rail accessories for that. The game nights, having a big variety of games, just having a lot of good space and some ways to help manage games that have the cards and all that kind of stuff. That's been really good. And some 40K and Kill Team works out really well. I really kind of like having those stratagem cards ready on the rail to kind of remind me. And in 8th edition, you'd have kind of objective cards and that kind of thing. So those are kind of the main ways that I've used it, and I've absolutely loved it for every game I've played on it so far. So I'm probably a little biased because I made it and I kind of knew exactly what I wanted to get out of the table for playing those games. But it really kind of came along without any major hiccups as far as playing games on it. So I've been really proud of it and had a lot of fun with it. And I think in the future too, Rob and I plan on doing some Frostgrave games, and possibly maybe even more in the future, some Blood Bowl games on the table. So if you're interested in some of those games, keep an eye out. In the future we might kind of do some of those on the channel here. So some general considerations if you were going to build a table like this. The first, I think, is the leg space. The way that the gate legs fold out on this, they make kind of an X pattern stemming off from the middle points of each side of the main, the center kind of piece. And I think that makes a lot of leg room out on the sides. If you're anywhere around either one of the two outside panels, you have so much leg room, it's awesome. But the decision you need to make is, if you're sitting in the middle of one of the long sides, are you going to take that panel underneath at the base all the way out and have a lot more storage, maybe for gaming mats and that kind of thing? Or do you not care about those games and you maybe want to shorten up that panel, not too much to where you're losing much stability, but just a little bit so you get a little more comfort out of the legroom? You certainly can adapt it, either way for either of those purposes, but it's something to think about. And I just would go with whatever games you think you're going to play the most, or what features you kind of value the most out of it. Another thing that people kind of seem to comment or ask about a lot, especially in the beginning, was like the integrity of the rail system, right? Like, you just look at one of those player desks slot in and you're just like, oh man, the day is going to come when somebody's going to just lean on that or bump into it or something. It's going to break off somewhere. And I had the same thought, but we've used it a bunch. We've bumped into the player desks and the cup holders and stuff. My 3-year-old has played around when the cup holders have been on and kind of fidgeted with them, and just I don't think she's intentionally being rough, but she's like 3, so it's taken a good bit of use. I'd say like a fair bit of use, and nothing has even come close to cracking or breaking. I've had like no problems with that. The way that I made this, though, each of the rails are just screwed on to the side. So there's a slot that they kind of fit over the rails to kind of help them seat and be centered on the boards. And then there's just screws that are kind of going in that open space in the rail and just taking it all the way into the panels. So if I ever did break anything, I think it would be the rail, because the grain on the rails is oriented this way, and the grain on all the accessories is perpendicular to it. And I think that would give the accessories a little bit more strength if you were kind of coming down on it. I think it would break along the fault line of the grain on the rail. And if that's the case, it's just screwed in. I can unscrew it, can mill up another rail that's just kind of like that, and kind of just replace it. It would be the easiest thing to replace, I think. Have not had to do that yet. I think if you're looking at a rail system like this, though, nothing replaces making some test pieces. Getting my hands on some test pieces and seeing how the mechanics of it actually worked, that was the best thing for my understanding here. And I actually had accidentally made the rail and the accessories grain go the same way, and I stress tested it, and yeah, they broke a lot. But switching the grain, I have Ben to thank for that. I wasn't even really thinking about that, but he said that I should switch the grain, and there's a lot of strength when you do that. So tinkering with it, a little bit of trial and error if you're going to do the rail systems. I think there's nothing that replaces that experience, so I would definitely advise that if you go to make a rail system like this. And then the last maybe consideration is if you want to do the rails underneath, or if you just want to have open storage down there. Again, kind of depending on what games or what kind of use you want to get out of the table, you can go either way, but it's something to kind of think ahead about a little bit. So there are some future considerations that I have when I'm stopped and thought about the gaming table here. And one of the biggest things that popped out to me when I was reading through the 9th edition rules are the battlefield sizes for the combat patrols, the incursion, and the strike force, I think. That smaller table size just got my brain percolating. It's kind of getting me thinking about somebody who was running smaller games or wanted even more practicality or ease of storage for the gaming table being out of the way. I think there's a lot of potential with figuring out some kind of variation on this idea to fold away, to break down a little bit, but for like a coffee table size for those size of games. So I've not entirely got my head around it, but I just feel like there has to be something there that would be a fun way to make a table for those sized games. And the other thing that I think would be fun, if the channel was able to grow, so this is probably a ways in the future, but I think if the channel got up to something kind of close to 10K subscribers or something like that, to me that would probably be a good point that would justify, because it's a lot of time and effort and cost that kind of goes into making a big piece like this, and the craftsmanship and everything, But I think if the channel grew to that size, it would be fun to do either like an iteration on this table, or like the coffee table idea, like I was saying, and look into doing something like a giveaway. I think it's something I would look into if the channel kind of got to that level. Because I know that there would be things that, depending on different countries, there's different rules and laws, regulations and stuff that kind of govern giveaways and that kind of thing. And I would have to think ahead too about like how the shipping would work with something like this. I've never shipped anything this size or weight before. But I would look into those things. I think if the channel grew to 10,000, that would be a good mark to start. That would be fun for me. And I don't want 2 gaming tables this size in my house, but I could get a little practice, iterate on it. I think that'd be kind of fun for the community too. So I have that idea in the back of my head. Who knows if or when that'll come, but we'll see. We'll see. Try to make it happen, I guess. All right. Well, I hope this was helpful. I hope that it kind of answered some questions, and gave you some things to think about if you're going to build a table like this or use some of the elements. If there's something you're wondering about that I kind of missed or I'm not thinking about, just put a question in the comments. I'll do my best to answer it and help you out. So thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.